Welcome back to my channel, I'm Natalie and today I'm going to share my latest pattern with you, the Florence Dress. A romantic dress to feel dramatic, timeless and customisable. You can find the pattern linked below on my Etsy page if you'd like to sew along with me at home. If you love sewing patterns, tutorials and vintage inspired makes, then don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss any of my videos. This version of the Florence dress is made with black velvet and white lace inspired by historical dark romances. Think period dramas from the 2000s and a little bit of Elle Fanning in the grey. The pattern features a long gathered skirt and a ruffles hem, and if you sew it without the hem it becomes a 3/4 length dress instead. There's also 3/4 length sleeves with an optional ruffled hem for those as well as an invisible zipper down the back for a clean finish. What I love most about the design is how adaptable it is. If you were to make it in a linen or a cotton, it would lean more to an everyday or cottagecore kind of look. You can also make it without the ruffles for a simple, cleaner look, or leave the sleeves off entirely for a fresh summer vibe. Grab a cup of tea and let's get sewing. I'm going to start by cutting out my skirt ruffles. I chose to use lace, so I laid this in half and then put my pattern pieces over the top and cut them out. I then cut out my main bodice pieces as well as some iron-on fusible interfacing. I ironed on my interfacing to the wrong side of my bodice pieces and then I moved on to the construction. I'm going to start by sewing the centre back piece and the side back piece together. To do this, just pin down the seams, making sure that the right seams are aligned and making sure that they are right sides together. Repeat this for both back sides, making sure that the two sides are opposite from each other when facing the right way around. Moving to the front now, we're going to secure our front centre piece and our front side piece. You want to make sure that right sides are together and that the seam you are pinning together will make the bust shape. We're then going to sew down that seam, being mindful of the curb and how we're sewing that. And now we're just going to repeat that for the other side. So placing the bust seams together, pinning along that seam and then sewing along it with the sewing machine. So now you should have your main front piece constructed and your two back pieces constructed. So now we're just going to pin our shoulder seams together, making sure that you've got the right side pinned to the right side. Then sew down that shoulder seam, and this is what everything should look like once you have sewn all of your main seams together. In case you are also sewing with velvet like I am, to press the seams, I like to press the seam as flat as possible before I open it, and then when I open it up I like to use some scrap cloth on either side when I press the seam open to make sure that I don't indent the velvet at all on the right side. I'm now going to cut some notches into the bust seam as it's quite a curved seam. This is just so that it lays nice and flat along the bust. Then I just press that bust seam open. Again, I just used my scrap pieces of fabric on either side because I'm sewing with velvet. So now you should have your bodice pieces and then also replicate this for the lining. We're going to move on to our sleeve pieces. We're going to do a gathering stitch, so turn your machine stitch length up to its highest setting, and then there is a notch line for where the gathers start and end. So we're going to sew a 0.5 seam allowance gathering stitch to the end of that notch line, and then we're going to do a second line of gathering stitches directly parallel to that one at a 1.5 seam allowance just in between those gathering guides. Now just gather your sleeve head so it's the same length as the armhole, and we're going to pin the sleeve to the armhole, right sides together, making sure to take note of the notches so that you're pinning the front of the sleeve to the front of the armhole. Now with everything pinned together and the sleeve gathered, we are going to sew the sleeve to the armhole, making sure that our seams are right sides together. We can then go ahead and remove the gathering stitches. I did mine in white so that I can see them nice and easily for when I need to remove them. Now line up the sleeve length and pin that together, aligning the armhole seam, and then pin down the rest of the side seam of the bodice. And then we're going to do this stitch in one go to make it easy to fit our sleeve into our bodice. So just sew down the length of the sleeve, and then when you get to the armhole seam, just pivot slightly and then sew down the rest of the bodice side seam. I am now gathering my sleeve ruffle by doing a gathering stitch at the machine's longest stitch length at a 0.5 seam allowance, and then I'm going to do another gathering stitch line right next to that at a 1.5 seam allowance. I'm now going to French seam the side seam of my sleeve ruffle. To do this, I am going to pin wrong sides together, and then I'm going to sew down this seam with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. I then trim the seam in half and then fold everything through so that the right sides are together, and then stitch down this side seam again by 0.5 seam allowance. We're now going to attach our sleeve ruffles to the sleeve, so put your sleeve ruffle over the sleeve, making sure that right sides are together, and then we're going to align the seams together in the middle. So this is the underneath seam of the arm and the side seam of the ruffle, and then we are going to pull our gathering stitches so that the ruffle is the same length as the armhole. Once everything's gathered and pinned, we are going to sew that on the sewing machine with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I like to sew it so that the ruffles are facing down, as it helps to feed them through the machine better and you get a more even gather. Do this for both sleeves and then just remove those gathering stitches afterwards so that you can't see them anymore. Now we are going to start attaching our bodice to our bodice lining. You can do this by pinning along the top of the neckline from the back seam all the way around and then to the back again. You want to make sure all of your main seams are aligned. Going over to the machine, we are now sewing our lining neckline and our main neckline together by 1 centimeter seam allowance. We are now going to understitch around our neckline, so that this means we are going to stitch our seam allowance to our lining side to make sure that it folds under nicely and we don't get any of the lining poking out of the neckline. So to do this, make sure all of your seam allowance is pressed towards the lining side, and then line up your needle so that the seam is roughly in line with the inside of the sewing foot on the left hand side if your lining is on the right. Moving on to my skirt pieces now, I'm going to do a French seam down either side, so this will connect to the front and 2 back pieces. So I like to start by putting my fabric's wrong sides together along those side seams, pinning down those seams and then sewing down that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I then trimmed my seam allowance in half, so this roughly ended up being about a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance once it was trimmed. And then I went over to my iron, and I pressed the seam nice and flat and then folded everything over so that the right sides were facing right sides, gave it a press again so it was a nice neat seam edge, and then I put a few pins in, and then we're going to go back over to the sewing machine. We're now going to sew down that seam to make it a French seam. We're going to sew it down by 1 centimetre seam allowance, making sure that it encases the seam inside of it. Now that we've done our French seams, we are going to gather along the top of the skirt. So I like to start just 1 centimetre from the back edge and then sew with my longest stitch length a 0.5 seam allowance line all the way to the end. And then next to that, I'm going to do another gathering stitch line parallel at 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So now pull your loose ends of your gathering stitches to gather the top of the skirt and pin it to the bodice so that everything should be the same length as the bodice. Starting at the open back, sew down the waist of your skirt and your bodice to attach them with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. And don't forget to remove those gathering stitches afterwards. Moving over to our invisible zipper, with the zipper open and the wrong side up, we're going to use the iron on not too hot of a setting to uncurl the zipper teeth. With the dress the right way up, we are going to pin the invisible zipper face down to the back neckline. We're then going to pin down the rest of the back. Then using a zipper foot, we are going to sew down the back of the dress to secure our zipper. I then like to zip the zip up a bit and mark out where the waist is so that everything is aligned when we sew the other side on, and then just start by pinning at the waistline and also making sure that our tops are aligned nicely as well. Again, you want to make sure that you have pinned the zip face down to the right side of our back seam. Make sure that everything is aligned and then sew down that zipper with your zipper foot again. To sew down the rest of the skirt, just pin at the points that you sewed up to with your invisible zipper, and then pin down the rest of the back skirt seam. We're then going to sew this seam with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, starting at the point of which you ended your zipper stitches. Then, because I want the inside seams of my garment to be nice and neat, I decided to bind the back seam. So to do this, I just bound from a little bit above the waistband all the way to the bottom of the skirt on either sides of that seam. You could also choose to overlock these seams, or you could use a zigzag stitch if your fabric doesn't vary as much as mine did. Now we are going to French seam both sides of our skirt ruffle together. So I started by putting my fabric wrong sides together, sewing 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, then trimming that seam down again, folding it around so that the right sides are together, and then sewing that by 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. I did this for both sides of the skirt ruffle. We're now going to do gathering stitches all the way around the top of our skirt ruffle. So I just start at one of the side seams and then use my loosest stitch setting and do a gathering stitch at a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. And then I do a parallel stitch line right next to that at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. I do this just because it helps to gather the fabric more evenly and it creates a channel for you to sew in between. I use the loose ends to pull the gathers, and then I pin my side seams to the side seams of my main skirt, making sure that right sides are together, and then I just make sure that all of the gathers make it so the same length of the skirt, and then I pin all of that together. We're now going to sew our ruffle onto the main skirt, so have the gathered piece on the bottom and sew at a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I then chose to bind this seam so that the gathers and the main skirt were all enclosed in the binding and there was no raw edges. You could also choose to overlock this seam. I think the binding just helps to get a really nice neat finish, and then you'll get a more professional looking garment afterwards. So because I was using a sheer lace, I chose to top stitch the seam allowance to my main skirt so that you couldn't see the seam allowance through the lace. You can choose to skip this step if you can't see through your ruffle. It's also worth noting that if you are using a regular fabric like a cotton to do your ruffle, you should just use a simple rolled hem to finish off the bottom of the skirt. Now all we have left to do is to hand stitch our lining to the rest of the bodice and our waistband. So to do this, take the raw edges of the lining and fold them back by 1 centimeter, and then do a simple ladder stitch by hand just to stitch down from the start of the neckline to the point of the waistband, across the waistband, and then back up to the other neckline. And then we are also going to do a hand stitch for our sleeves as well. So I just did a ladder stitch around the inside of the sleeve.
And that is the Florence dress all finished. If you'd like to make your own version of the Florence dress, the pattern is available now on my Etsy and I have linked it in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any more videos like this. Don't forget to hit the bell button so you're notified of all of my future sewing patterns and tutorials. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.